Welcome everyone to another episode of Legends and Lectures. And today we have a special guest from a neighboring podcast, Graeme from Tales of Britain and Ireland. Graeme Cooke, welcome. Will you
Hello,
please,
Michelle.
thanks for being here. Will you please introduce yourself and your channel, your podcast, and for everybody who doesn't know what you do?
Okay, so for everybody who doesn't know what I do, which I assume is most people here, I have a podcast, like all middle-aged white men. It's called Tales of Britain and Ireland, which is on the flag behind me there, might be mirrored, not sure. And on that podcast, I tell myths, legends, folk tales, stories from all across Britain and Ireland and throughout their history in no particular order. That's the blurb, at least. I tend to tell them in quite a modern-ish style. But I also do a little bit of discussion about the legends that I tell, and I think that's probably why I'm here today, just looking into a bit of the folklore and the history behind them. I also don't release very regularly either, so you'll get 4 or 5 episodes a year from me if you're lucky, but they'll all be very long.
Yes,
And that's
I
me.
just listened to the episode about giants, which was a giant episode.
Oh, it was though. Yes, yeah. And there's too many. There's too many stories. Mostly I kind of well, I do some episodes where I tell one story, and some episodes where I think, oh, I'll tell lots of little stories. But what always happens is that the little stories I just make bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And then when you try to do lots of them, you're like, oh, well, I'm just gone now. But I hope you enjoyed that episode anyway. I can't remember what actually made the final cut. I know I took a lot out, but there was the mermaid seducing the giants up in Scotland, wasn't there? I remember that one.
So talk a little bit. I mean, you mentioned very briefly the Carnaby giant or something similar. You also mentioned very briefly some of the giants that were put into ancient British legend. And really, what I wanted to talk to you about is what is the difference between folklore and mythology? How are they different and how do they operate differently?
Right, okay. So I think this 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 whole question we've come to discuss today of what is folklore is going to involve a lot of talking about definitions. And I should say for everyone watching and listening that I am not an expert. I'm not a folklorist. I'm not an academic in this area. I'm predominantly a storyteller, and I've got a very British centric view of the world as well. So just caveat it with that. But I think folklore and legend, mythology, are radically different things. And I think that helps if we sort of look at the definition of folklore as you'd go and find it on Wikipedia or a more reliable place on the Folklore Thursday website, which I have cribbed this from. I'm just going to read it straight here. Now, the definition that's on there says folklore is the traditions, beliefs, customs, and stories of a community passed through generations by word of mouth. Folklore is also contemporary and includes urban legends, current trends, and internet memes. And that definition is interesting, I think, for two reasons. First of all, if you think of what's encompassed by traditions, beliefs, customs, stories, it's obviously very broad indeed. And just within that little definition there, which I think is a reasonably good one, there is a contradiction because it says that they're passed by word of mouth, and then it says it also includes internet memes. And that and I'm not using this to shit on their definition, absolutely not. Because the definition of the word folklore is one of those things that's really up for debate. It's
Hmm.
quite a new word, as I'm sure you know, possibly better than me even. It was only invented in 1840s, and it was to describe a field of study, really a sort of a field of study which was looking at old legends and ballads and a whole load of other stuff.
Yeah, there's a lot
Um,
of custom, as you said. I mean, there's also like child
Customs,
game folklore.
yeah, and it was formed by a person who went on to form the Folklore Society, whose name I have forgotten is William Tom. Um, he came up with that word and said, "Well, this is folklore," but it was something that's been studied well before that. But what this has done is because it can encompass so much, people argue about what it means a lot. And when I say people, I mean the academics who study this folklore and say, well, what is this thing that we're studying anyway. They disagree. There's a to sort of go into a bit more detail about what folklore is. I've also just got here, which I'm going to read because well, I'm going to read bits of them. There's a dictionary from the 1970s where the Funk and Wagnall's Standard Dictionary of Folklore, where they asked some of the leading voices in folklore academia to define what folklore was. And they got 21 answers, and they're all quite different, to be honest. And they're all very long indeed. So there's one here that just starts off with, in a purely oral culture, everything is folklore, which is pretty broad, gives you some sense of the scale of what folklore is here. Another one says the term folklore has come to mean myths, legends, folk tales, proverbs, riddles, verse, and a variety of other forms of artistic expression whose medium is spoken word. Thus, folklore is verbal art. But if you go over the page, there's somebody talking about how folklore encompasses things such as performances, dances, plays, and even buildings.
Yes, that's right.
So there's a lot of stuff that's encompassed by folklore as this idea, and no one quite agrees on what exactly it all is.
The
Um,
the word came from it was coined by antiquarian. It was William J. Toms in 1846, and he was talking about it in terms of Anglo-Saxon antiquarianism, and it's really just things that belong to the common folk. That's about it. And what is that? Everything that you've just said.
yeah, but then that opens up a question straight away, doesn't it? Well, who are the common folk?
Hmm.
And what exactly does the common folk mean? And then you wander off on all these little tangents, like the person there, that definition I pulled out that said everything in an oral culture is folklore. Does that mean that everything is the common folk? It's not very clear. I mean, there's lots of things in what we might consider to be folklore that might have been produced by very rich people, but when they're saying them, we sort of think, well, actually, they're probably folklore. I think that's a generally accepted thing, legends transmitted orally. And I sort of think that first of all, the definition is woolly and changes. That's just it. It's not a fixed thing. And it's almost better to consider, well, what isn't folklore? And to look at it from that way to say, well, okay, if we're talking about culture as a whole, almost everything that people get up to on their day-to-day basis, and I'll come on to the Irish Handbook of Folklore in a bit because I think that's
Hmm.
worth looking at. Um, then what isn't folklore? And I think it's quite. There are some things that the folklore we tend to say really aren't folklore, and there's a couple of common threads, and all of this there's exceptions to. But I think that the biggest common threads for me are a combination of written down and then reproduced off that writing faithfully to some degree. An author, when something has an author that is a known author, and yeah, there are issues, but broadly speaking, it isn't folklore, especially if it's then transmitted in a medium that says, by the way, this person wrote that down. This person created this work, whatever it is, be it a play, because there could be folkloric plays that aren't like that, and that author has some kind of like control over what the true version of the tale or the dance or the whatever it might be is, or regardless of whether it's written by an author or it's well written, I suppose, created by an author, even written and named author, anything that's transmitted via some form of institution. I use that term very woolly, and you can go down, oh, what does an institution mean? But something that has an authority over the text that it's transmitting, be it a state, be it a church, I think is one of the older ones, be it a company nowadays. And some form of combination of those very woolly goes, well, these aren't really folklore. Doesn't mean they can't. And what I everywhere you go trying to define things, you have just have pitfalls everywhere. And I'm a kind of person who just comes and says, well, I don't mean that, and I don't mean that. So I don't mean that just because something's written down, it can't become folklore again,
Yes,
because
that's
it
yeah.
certainly can. Like the works of Shakespeare, we know end up in what we would call folklore because they're being transmitted in a method that doesn't apply to any of those. They're being transmitted by people by word of mouth, and they sort of can re-enter folklore in that way because
Hmm.
they're not being transmitted by these authors, by these institutions. They're not being transmitted written down.
Just to give an example of what you're saying, so for example, Her and the Hunter was invented by Shakespeare. And that character then has gotten swept up in so many other stories and folklore as well. A lot of the King Arthur tales as well. People, when they were writing the romances, they took all these characters and went, I like Lancelot. I'm now going to make an entire fan fiction about Lancelot and his backstory. And then that fan fiction goes on, and then all the other characters in his story then get taken up. And now it's part of I mean, we could say mythos really for Arthur, but these started out as folk tales that were then transmitted and then written down. And so you have people building and building. And as you say, what is the canon? I think a lot of us are very concerned about nowadays. Like if we think of something like Marvel, right? We go, well, what's canon? I don't know what canon is. You're going, eh. At this point,
Yeah,
it doesn't matter.
absolutely, and that's because there isn't these things watching saying there is a canon. It's just like, well, here's a
Yeah.
story, and then somebody else says the story, or I'm already I've fallen into a trap where I'm talking about stories a lot because that's what I do, but also because a lot of people think of folklore as stories, where that
Yes.
huge definition we had before, stories are one little tiny part of that. So yes, where were we? Back a bit. I do ramble. It's sort of a bit my MO.
It's
Um,
good. We love a rambler.
but back a bit to what we were just saying before we move away from that. I think there are reasons why folklore was termed as a word to look at things that weren't being studied because there were aspects of culture that weren't being written down, and people decided that what they do is they group them together under this heading of folklore. That doesn't mean that's when it began. Um, People have been writing these down since Babylonian times, but they grouped it together under this, and now we've got this idea of folklore. But that immediately creates an idea like that these you've got folklore, you've got everything that isn't folklore, and the two are a bit different. And we talk about things passing between folklore and like you've just done accurately, because now we've defined folklore and everything that isn't folklore, the rest of culture, and we talk about things passing between them. But even that's a bit of a, well, that isn't how anyone saw it in the past. Basically, up until the point where people are starting to define this, it doesn't really exist. So people might hear a good play that somebody has written down that's being transmitted in a non-folklore way, like the Shakespeare, and then think, great, I'll go and just tell that to me mates at the pub or whatever it might be. Then it's in folklore, bam, bam, bam. And no one thinks about it like that. Similarly, we've kind of created this artificial divide that allows us to look, that frames how we look at the past. And as much as possible, we've both got to find the use in that, but also say, but yeah, people didn't see it like that. Does that make sense? I feel
Yeah,
like
of
I'm
course. I mean,
talking.
really before Victorian times. I mean, early Victorians were the ones who were really trying to make sense of this, and that's where they came up with the term folklore and the whole study of how do we define culture that is passed down and sometimes written down, and how do we define this culture that takes on a life of its own? Like you said, whether it be plays, whether it be characters, whether it be poetry, how do we define this? Like I said, there's also children's folklore, children's games that people specialize in, like Roud. And it became its whole a study, really part of anthropology, as a way to study how people relate to things that they create and whatever they create and the stories that they create. And we'll talk in a minute about the different what actually constitutes as folklore versus religion as well, because that there is that element of people like to uh, tag folkloric tropes to ancient religions, and sometimes, as Victorians found out, sometimes that doesn't always work. So speaking of which, what role did folklore have in olden days, in the days before phones and things like that? as opposed to the role that it has now?
Well, I'm gonna just I'm gonna answer that by just doubling down to say the role that folklore had in communities before writing was just folklore, meaning that fuller term. And I think maybe for the discussion later on, we might narrow it down to how it's often used. But I think it is worth saying that how much is encompassed by this idea of the academic discipline of folklore, but also it is worth considering under this broad brush banner. Before we do try to maybe narrow it down to something like that. I'm gonna whip out. Well, I don't have a copy, unfortunately, but I'm going to whip out the Handbook of Irish Folklore. This is something that was written in the 1930s, but mine one's actually slightly later, updated in the 40s. And this is whereby this thing started by the Victorians has become a lot more of a science, I suppose. And I would probably say it's one of the by the time of the Irish Folklore Commission and the Irish Handbook, it's really reached its zenith almost in terms of that scientific approach. And to really hammer home how big this is a 800 odd page book, which is not about Irish folklore. It is about the types of Irish folklore. And it is so long. And I think just to kind of give, and I love it. I absolutely love it. I think it's really instructive into because it's a text for folklore collectors, essentially, to say, go and find out about this from all the people that you interview. And I have literally no idea how anyone. There's you're not meant to actually go. You can't be meant to ask every single one of these questions to a person because it's a lifetime's worth of stuff for them. And I just
It's
think it's
amazing
actually
what being rich and bored can do.
well, to be fair, I'm gonna. It, the Irish Folklore Commission is a really interesting one, and I may as well talk about it now a bit. So, unlike a lot of the Victorian folklorists in Britain and Ireland, especially, but also, well, as Victorian, to be fair, right across the continent, are mostly people who are rich and bored, as you said. Um, and they are collecting folklore in various different ways and means, however suits them. And some of them, their work may be accurate, some of it may not be. It's fine. By the time of the Irish Folklore Commission, what that is it's a project that's really quite connected to the relatively newly formed Irish state at that time, that was set up to really give a scientific approach to it. So rather than being wealthy, particularly wealthy people, it was set up by some academics, Seamus O'Dolega, James DeLargy, being the prominent one who did it, and then given some money by the state. Douglas Hyde, the first president of Ireland, he was a folklorist himself and gave money to this project. And then what they did, rather than just, rather than, I don't know, a few people at the top going out and collecting, is that they gave this to the country as a thing to do. And they did that by recruiting local collectors, people who lived within the communities who were already trusted to go round and collect stuff. That's who this handbook's sort of for, really, to say, right, whoever you are, you live in this community, go and ask them all these questions. I don't know how many asked them all that. And also, interestingly, what they did was they had a massive campaign of writing to school children, oh, sorry, of getting school children to write every one of these stories and traditions and la 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 that they knew down. Um, Going back to their go home, ask your parents, ask your grandparents, write everything down. And the output of this is millions of pages, which are largely available online now. What are we now? 80 years later and searchable. And I think it's there are other things like this in Europe, especially in Scandinavia, but this one is pretty much the high point of this sort of folklore collecting and at the end of the
Dukish.ie,
time.
I think, right? Is
Yeah, dukas.ie,
yeah.
precisely. If you want to go, and I can lose myself for hours in there.
Oh, it's a rabbit hole. It's
Yeah,
so fun. Yeah.
by this point, so for anyone who's for anyone who's worried, there's by this point, while a lot of the folklore is obviously in Irish, Ireland is predominantly English speaking. Most of the documents are in English, and you can just go in and just type in. Well, fairies would be an obvious one, wouldn't it? But and there'll be stories there, and there will be stories there that you read that you've never read before. because no one can write all these down and publish them all. People are here and there and everywhere, but there's so much stuff there, and they're just great. They're great to read. I would thoroughly recommend. Yeah, go to duchas.ie and have some fun because they're great. That's what I do for fun. Anyway, yes. So yes. Where was that all going? So yes, that's so. I was defending the fact that they weren't just rich bored people by this point.
No, not always. They're not always, no. But that is when we talk about the Folklore Society, which is a British society.
Yes, I think that's rather different, and I
Yes.
think yes, certainly if not very rich, which some of them were upper middle class, which as well. So yes, but this was something rather different. Anyway, where was I going? I was going to say I was going to read you the headings from this 700-page book, the big headings, and then I was just going to give you a flavor of the kind of stuff encompassed by it because he said, well, what does folklore mean in the past? It's everything, and by which. So the headings are settlement and dwelling, livelihood and household support, communications and trade, the community, human life, nature, folk medicine, times, principles and practices of popular belief, historical traditions, religious traditions, mythological traditions, and popular oral literature. So it's divided into these sections, and each of these sections is divided into. Here's a bit from the. Which section is this actually from? Actually, from livelihood and household support. Ask questions about eggs and hatching, the laying of eggs. Um, so we have, yes, so we have the laying of eggs, broken eggs, meaning tricks with eggs, cures from eggs, eggs as food, disposal of eggshells, etc., etc., etc. That's one page.
Yeah,
That's
it's just
that's
small
that's
things.
that's one section from one page. Every part of human life is, I swear, covered in these 800 pages. At least as it pertains to Ireland, because of course there are things that are very specific. It's got lots of questions about, rabbits and stuff you might not get elsewhere, but that is the level. When we talk about folklore at that level, that's it. It's everything. Very little stuff isn't really folklore. And I think it's sort of useful to define it that broadly sometimes, if only because it doesn't create the idea that the much more narrow definition of folklore that has sort of formed popularly, um, it, to not limit it in that way. And I think all that stuff is kind of part and parcel of how people used to know the world and the knowledge of it. If we're going to have a folk, and I'm not convinced it's a necessarily useful term, but we are going to have one, they knew a hell of a lot of stuff and had a lot of opinions on things, and all of that is contained within the folklore, which probably isn't really the answer to the question that you wanted.
No, no, no.
But
I think that's quite important to point out is nowadays, we think of folklore as a very, as you said, a very narrow subject of maybe some stories, maybe some characters, maybe some customs. But back in the day, it was all culture. It was everything, and the folklore and the customs changed from village to village, from region to region. And to think that, an entire country did exactly the same thing, that's a very modern idea. To think that one country speaks a certain language, has a certain set of stories, has a certain set of customs. That's not how things were at all. I mean, we were talking recently, for those who don't know, we're recording a little bit after Epiphany. And so recently we were talking about La Befana and how she is only in one region of Italy. And she comes on the 6th of January, and she's a Christmas witch who gives kids nuts and candy, presents, things like that. Not all Italy has this, and people forget that Italy was not a unified nation, I think, until 1861. And so you have all of these regional customs that are now getting lost because now that we're all together and our idea of an entire country doing a certain thing as well. This weekend, there is a custom in Spain, but in one specific country, one specific region in the north, where they have los trapajones, which are these enormous characters who are dressed in dead leaves and things, and they come around the town and they do dances together with bears, and they bless this entire region. And it's only this part of Spain that has this tradition. And again, we tend to think of Spain as a homogeneous subject, whereas as you said, before modern times, the world was not like that at all. Or even something, let's say, like Japan, where they have the Namahage, who are some of my favorite folklore characters. The Namahage live in Akita, and they're only in Akita, and they come down from the mountain. And they're these giant ogre-like, orc-like demons that have blue and red faces. And they have a giant kitchen knife and a bucket. And they go around the houses and towns and they go, "Rah!" And they scream to not they're considered to be good characters. They bring in good luck to the house, but they scream to the kids, you better behave and do your homework. And they make sure that they get rid of all bad or evil things that are in the house or in the town. And that's a very tiny region of Japan that has a specific custom. But when that they still maintain those folkloric traditions, but not everywhere in Japan does. And so I think, but other regions have other customs. And so when we think of modern folklore, yeah, maybe it is internet memes and how certain swaths of the internet, how they interact with certain memes, how they share. But meme culture is part of our modern folklore. But that doesn't mean that ancient people didn't see other things as memes. So, for example, things like Robin Hood plays, right? Robin Hood was originally not a good guy in the original plays. In one of the earliest mentions of the his story, he kills a priest, beheads a kid. Like it's really not good. But the audience, he's meant to be a very mischievous character. And we are meant to sympathize with the church because this was all part of the time where church was incorporating local folklore customs in order to get money. It worked. And so then people riffed on Robin Hood and they started adding characters. So what we think of today as folklore, yes, it differs from olden times. But as you said, pretty much everything could be considered part of ancient folklore. But now we're going to talk about what folklore is not. So, how can folklore sometimes be mistaken or misused?
Well, how long have you got? I think you've already said quite a lot there
Please
about
take your
that.
time.
But no, so I mean, how can well, I think it's really, I think just to pick up slightly on something you've already said, because I think you've sort of grabbed that around there when you've talked about, countries having different regions and folklore and stuff like that. And I think it's worth saying that the the science of folklore, the discipline of folklore, science is possibly a bit of a controversial word, but the study of folklore and the process of folklore as a process where you can collect stuff and all of that is very much tied up with nationalist movements at the end of the 19th century,
Hmm.
before the word folklore, but obviously a lot of the similar stuff was happening with the Brothers Grimm, and they owe a bit of a debt to Herder and his theories, and a lot of ideas at this sort of time, where, to simplify it down a lot, the fundamental idea of a lot of this was that a nation was a unit that existed naturally in the world, and that nation had a soul, so to
Yeah,
speak,
the
and
nation states, yeah, creation of nation states.
yeah, and that soul that they had often, Germany being the prime example, where Germany was, because now I think it's so easy to think the state and the nation are the same, and they're just, this is relatively a new idea, or at least for it to be totally, it was a new idea. And in Germany there was a lot of idea to unify the country, and if you wanted to find this unified country, you'd find its soul, which was the natural state as it became, and the natural nation. And the theory was that this could be found within the stories, the songs, the folk poets, as they were called, of the people. And so a lot of the early folklore work riffs on this theme, and you don't just see it in Germany, you see it in well, almost everywhere that folklore sort of crops up, with England being a strange example, possibly because there the nation and the state were, there was no desire to create a state out of it. The nation, those were aligned, but you do see it in the other places in Britain. You see similar things happening in Scotland. You certainly see it in Ireland, as we've sort of already discussed. that idea of nation and folklore being closely knitted together was part of this. And there was the idea that you could extract the nation from the culture of the people who occupied it. And I would say that probably starts us off with a place that folklore was misused right at its very origins. Though without saying that people can't find, there's not genuine good stuff to be mined from a nation from its past. But I think that blanket, well, these are the stories that make our nation, and they're nobody else's. Well, clearly that is not accurate, and it all gets tied up with what we went horribly off the rails with nationalism in the 20th century. So I'd say that's certainly one bad place to start. And I think what is really sort of ironic in some ways is that you end up, it's, how can I, what you said there was very accurate in that you've got very specific regional things that people want to say, oh, well, this was the whole nation, which obviously wasn't true. But you've then got the reverse that you find, whereby a story is common right across a region or multiple regions or multiple nations, and yet people want to claim, oh, well, it's just ours. But actually, things like, to give examples feels like they're the only ones. Huge amounts all of our oral history and culture and all that is just shared right across. There's a folklorist very well recommend called Michael Fortune, one of the ones who
Oh
really
yes, his stuff is amazing. Yeah.
absolutely one of my absolute favorites. Because he actually is still one of the few people collecting,
Yes,
maybe not the few, but
folklore.ie is his website. He's
he
unbelievable.
collects folklore, still interviewing people and things, and it's great. But he points out a lot of the things that people say are Celtic, which is a very problematic term, but or just Irish, were practiced all across Europe, especially with he's about Halloween. He uses an example and says, look, the Irish didn't invent Halloween. These customs you say are Irish were across the rest of Europe. We've
Yeah,
just sort
we
of
had that when we talked about our Halloween special. We talked about how ancient Samhain, we actually don't know how it was celebrated. And Sanas Cormac, which is the earliest mention that we have of Samhain, is very clear in that we have no idea what customs were part of it. And even Sanas Cormac is a little bit late if you want to talk about the Christianization of Ireland.
yeah, very much
And
so.
we have no idea how ancient people celebrated Samhain. We can furnish a guess because of some of the mythological stories, but even those are quite late. So we don't know. And a lot of the customs that people think are pagan are actually really just down to the Day of the Dead, which is celebrated across Europe and really across the world nowadays.
Yeah, and I think, do you know what that brings me on to? So let's go with there's a thing that the nation being one misused folklore. I think one of the other things that's misunderstanding is possibly that it lends itself to a misunderstanding of history because there's so much folklore that we do have. Someone has written it down, and we now have access to it. That it's very easy to think, and I don't just say this because it's hypothetical. It is represented all across all the time, that somehow that gives us something approaching a totality of knowledge of folklore, like we might like we might know, I don't know, something better to know, all the animals in the world or something like that. And that's so far from the truth, it's just unreal. We don't know so much we know a fraction of a fraction of a percentage of the big toe of folklore. It's really because when people collect this stuff and we get the written records that we can access now, it doesn't start in any earnest until the 19th century, which is one particular moment in time.
Yes.
And otherwise, you get like little echoes for the past 1,000 years in, and what I know, Britain, you get bits and pieces, but they're one moment in time, one little snatch of time, which got no idea how much it changes. And what we do know is it changes a lot, or certain aspects of it does. And then before that, you've got nothing. You literally don't know. And the only thing you can do, you can throw your hands up and say you don't know, and you have to look at some archaeological evidence, and everything's so much speculation. And what I will say is and I think it's also really important to remember the amount of folklore we do get in the 19th century. I find staggering when you look at the limited amount of people that are collecting and writing this stuff down and you've got a few storytellers that people might go to, and that storyteller will know 200 stories, and
Yeah.
they'll write them down, and it's a book. It's a reasonable length book. And there were, and once again, I'm just talking about stories, which I'm narrowing it down a bit, but just talking about stories. I think you can't then say, well, that storyteller knew all the stories that were around at this moment in time, never mind the last time. If you have a couple of hundred of those level of storytellers in a community of, I don't know, a community, let's say in a in a country, even just a couple of hundred of those, and I've got no idea what the number's right, could be thousands, could be less. You've got some of those, each of them knows another 100 odd stories. The amount of stuff, the amount of shared stuff that there is, it's just mind blowing. And we have,
There's a folklorist from Arkansas who talks exactly about that because he got a lot of his stories from his grandmother. And he noticed that every time she would tell them, she would change something or she would build on it and build on it. And then when somebody passed down her stories, they would change something and build on it. So we have no idea what has changed, or I mean, we can catalog certain things that have been written down, but oral tradition, we really don't know. So there is a danger in people saying, as you said, yes, this is exactly how it was, and there's no difference in any custom change. We don't know that. We
I
have
think we radically underestimate the just as a society. I know it's nobody's fault. I just think the way we are and the way that so much of our culture is given to us in forms that are reproducible, we just underestimate how much the human brain is able to store that doesn't come from that methodology and how much is able to transmit. And we just do not have clear ideas about a lot of what people believed in the past. And yeah, once you get past 1,000 years, like you can you can pick up some big things. I've got a book that is far beyond me. It might be better for you. It's all about linguistics, about elves in Anglo-Saxon England that looks at some of the linguistic traces that we can start to work stuff out by a very notable Alaric Hall, a very notable scholar in the field. And that basically concludes, and I'm doing a massive disservice to his work here, but it does basically conclude, yeah, we don't really know what was going on here.
that's it.
Um, because that's it. That's it at the end of the day.
We
Please
recently
do
talked
go read
about
his work and take away his real conclusion. I would encourage you all to do that. But
It's
that's what
good
I took
that
away
you
from
mentioned
it.
fairies though, because recently we talked about Irish mythology and we talked about things about Bridget and the gods in the Tuatha De Danann and how do we know? How do we know that they actually worship? And the answer is we really don't. We don't know.
Oh,
It's the same thing with, Viking sagas. We can talk about the sagas all day to today to tomorrow, and we really don't know how because not all of them, obviously, but because many sagas were written down by one person who was a Christian, we really don't know exactly what Vikings believed. We know that there was certain veneration, there was certain worship. We can look at as you said, we can look at the archaeological record, but we don't know necessarily how they did things. Snorri can tell us that King Haakon the Good was the man who changed the date of Yule from Yule to modern Christmas. But we have to take his word for it. We don't actually know. And he tells us that ancient Yule had something to do with the swearing of oaths and the sacrificing of boars and possibly something to do with horses. That's about it. That's all we know.
yeah.
And so for people to say, yes, we absolutely, because of this folklore, because of these songs, we absolutely know how something was done. No, we don't. We
I,
have
I
no
think
idea.
I think in some podcast episode, and I know I mean, it's ridiculous to say that it's like trying to recreate the entirety of all superhero comics everywhere in the world and all the
Yeah.
mythology from half an episode of Jessica Jones on and a burnt and a burnt half of the first Superman comic. I mean, that's it. That's what you got. If that, I mean, that would be good. You just can't do it, and which doesn't mean we don't know stuff because there's still a lot of stuff out there. But it does mean that using folklore to make these big conclusions, and I think that is how it's often presented on the internet, certainty, and because that's often what people want. It ain't doable
No.
at
And
all.
as you said, we are a society that deals in absolutes. We like knowing things, and a lot of us go on bro, trust me logic, which unfortunately, leads to a lot of things like conspiracies or mistaken ideas about how history was. And we can't really infer all we can study plays, we can study songs, and we can catalog how far back that goes in written record. But we can't really do much else about certain customs. We can trace things linguistically, as you said, especially with things like elves. But when it comes to certain customs or when it comes to certain folkloric elements, you just have to throw your hands up at one point and go, we don't know. And that's
Yeah.
that. Um,
I really like the odd places that people go, and I say I'm not an academic at all, but I'm always impressed that people do stuff like pla place names.
yeah.
Work. Oh well, probably they believe in this here because this thing seems to be named like it. And I know there's a lot of work done in linguistics, and I cannot speak for its accuracy, talking about tracing old legends back down the Indo-European family tree to see which are the oldest stories, which I'm always a little suspicious about, but it's people have to use these proxies to try and work this stuff out. Just tell you how little we can know, which sounds very defeatist, doesn't it? It's not
But
meant to.
see, I'm
It's
like
just
you, and
realistic.
I love that we don't know. I think a lot of people say, "Oh, we don't know," so then what's the point in studying? Like, no, that's the joy of it. People are archaeologists are discovering things all the time. Historians are dispelling historical myths all the time, and I think that is the whole purpose of studying these things is to, yeah, sure, to catalog them. And sometimes, yeah, we just don't know. But new things happen all the time. New discoveries are made all the time. And that's the point of studying them. It's not a wasted science. It's not a wasted ology. And even if all we can do is recreate or tell these stories or recreate these customs in a different way, customs have comebacks all the time. We talk about now about things like plays. Mystery plays are coming back. Things like guising, obviously, we have trick-or-treating, but guising is coming back and now being reinvented in certain parts of the world. There's nothing wrong with reviving, the world goes through folklore revivals all the time. There's nothing wrong with that. But there is a mistaken idea in thinking certain things are very ancient. Like there was the idea for a very long time that for some reason that mummers plays, Victorians thought that they were remnants of Neolithic, like Neolithic. We have no, we know where mummers plays come from. There was a great craze for them in the 18th and 19th century, and very possibly they came from older hobby horse traditions, which were late medieval. And we do have some hobby horse traditions that we can trace to the 13th century. But that's it. That doesn't mean that we can't revive those things. That also doesn't mean that these things were ancient and that they go back 2,000, 3,000 years. We have to accept that hashtag people come up with shit all the time. That's what they do. People like celebrating, they like celebrating things, they like creating stories. It doesn't mean that they have any ancient ties or that they have any religious affiliation either.
Yeah, absolutely. Could agree with everything you've just said there, to be honest. Not a thing to disagree. I think I think about when it talks to revivals and stuff, like yeah, and folklore definitely feeling like people always say folklore is having a moment, but it feels like they've been saying that for at least like 15 years. So I just think it's just eh, folklore in this more specific sense of the old stories, particularly rituals, um, song to a certain extent, I think is something that people really get into. I also think that I mean, a big list of things which I think are covered by folklore now. One thing I've noticed as a you could say this is probably you could say this is wrong in some ways. It's a misuse of the term, but certainly now folklore and supernatural experiences, however, like modern day people experiencing supernatural, are sort of put together. Now, that's not to say that folklore in the past excluded those kind of experiences. Supernatural experiences were a minor part of folklore, certainly, but one of the most interesting ones to a lot of people. But today, those make up a large amount of what people are interested in folklore, and they badge their own experiences often under the heading of folklore. I think experiences with ghosts, with demons, with whatever it might be, gets bagged under this folklore thing. And I think there's a couple of other, I would say, related fields as well that really get badged as folklore, which have very little to do with this wider folklore we've been talking about. And I would say astrology, tarot, and neo-paganism are things that you see front and center of what of discussions of folklore. I'm in a local folklore group, which is very good, the Sheffield Folklore Society. But when I turned up to that, I was very interested that a large part of their discussions is around encounters with the supernatural and is around tarot readings and things like that. The way that folklore is understood in that much more narrow definition, and kind of you could say inaccurate, but it's meant to be the past as well, is yeah, yeah, I think that's wittering now, but that's the point in general is that that is really a big part of folklore as it is understood nowadays, which wasn't really the case in the past, well, at all, and certainly wasn't front and center of these societies, I would say.
Yeah, they weren't really concerned with that. As well, folklore is something that's shared amongst the folk. So if you have your own stories about ghosts, that's wonderful. I mean, ghosts have been with us literally since Mesopotamia. So we have Babylonian text about the difference between ghosts and demons. But that was something that was shared, in their society. A story about your own experience with a ghost is not necessarily folklore unless you are, let's say, you're meeting with the Slender Man. The Slender
But
Man is a very good example of a modern folklore, right? Because even though we know that's invented and that was invented on the internet in the early 2000s, that's something that people then experience and share is the concept of the Slenderman.
yeah,
But
definitely, and I think yeah, it becomes the method of transmission in modern society is
yes.
because everything it's sort of flipped and very little is folklore these days, I would say. Maybe wrongly. I'm sure there's many folklorists who disagree fundamentally with that statement, but I think it's probably true. Um, that things like the Slender Man become that, but it is, and I think one of the other. I'm just trying to shoot down some of the common things I see as we go and passing. There's so many. One of the other common things that I think people sort of you see a lot of is the idea that because you do have encounters with the supernatural in folklore, that's a thing that people and they really home in on, is that everything supernatural in the past was either believed in or was a story to explain a real world happening.
Yeah, that's a big
Neither
one.
of which,
Yeah.
like most, let's generalize, most stories about the supernatural, people were telling us stories, I think. It's a very broad statement I've just made there, but it was going to be at least 50-50 at least.
But
Wasn't like
it's
they
true what you
always
say
thought so.
though, because there's a lot of people who, but back when the discovery of dinosaurs was really just beginning, there were lots of people who said, "Oh, dragons in mythology were really just cultural memories of dinosaurs." I'm like, how we that is a severe misunderstanding of the of the,
You
the
see, you
human
see, you see, I
record.
think that, but you've been to Ron and thought, no, you watched this video on dragons.
Yes, of course, yeah, yeah,
Because
for
he
sure.
comes to that conclusion, that is a massive distance, but he comes to a very similar. I was like, that's very close to that, which I found fascinating. That's an aside. Go and watch that video. It's a very good video. But I found it really interesting that he's almost cleverly circled back to that at the end. And I was like, oof. I'm a big dinosaur fan myself, by the way. So, yes.
Yes, so sorry to disappoint you, Graham.
Sorry, no, I found that really interesting. I found it interesting, but yes, and there's lots of stuff like this. The idea that people have to there are dinosaur bones were known, and there was lots of the giants. Some of the giants in maybe I'm wandering off here. Britain in those stories might well have been related to dinosaur bones. And we've got the story of Saint Hilda and various other saints, depending on where you are, making the Ammonites by turning all the snakes to stone and stuff like that. But whether people believe that, I don't think they did.
No.
And they didn't, or somebody who might not have seen them, might have heard it later on and thought absolutely it was. But a lot of people would just know that that didn't make any sense. Regardless. So yes, I just wanted to say that yes, and people in the past didn't blindly believe in the supernatural, but also they did believe in a lot of it as well. I don't want to go too far either way. People definitely believed in fairies, for instance, the big one that everyone loves, me included. Malevolent race of supernatural, otherworldly, maybe not
Yeah,
otherworldly,
that's actually a
supernatural
great
entities.
example of how folklore changes because you and I know the fairies as people who are the wee people who are mischievous, not always good, and have their own society where, and obviously again it depends on country to country, region to region, what you're talking about in terms of fairies, what you think they are, etc. But nowadays there are many people who love fairies and people who have this sort of magical idea of pixies, bestowing great deeds upon people, and you just go, okay. Again, you can't comment on how people engage with modern folklore, but that's a really good shift on how people in the olden days used to think of fairies versus how people interact with them now.
Yeah, I mean, and all the. I think so much of our culture owes its roots to folklore by like necessity, because we only get here by creating more culture on top of more culture, and most culture was folkloric. But you can end up so far away from it. You know, vampires being the other one. Like vampires, one of the things we've got now that people are nothing like it, which is fine. But it's quite likely that what some people called a vampire in one village is very different from what they call it in another village, and it's very different again from what they called it in the 19th century to what they might have used that term. And my vampire knowledge isn't great here, so don't take any of this as what 500 years earlier, different again. And
Yeah, if you
that's fine, and that's good.
even in
I
early
would say
Victorian times, if you look at something like Carmilla, right? Carmilla was earlier than Dracula, but Carmilla was more of a emotional sucking vampire, an emotional vampire, whereas Dracula wasn't, obviously. And again, these are all created characters that were possibly or maybe not based off earlier folklore, like the Avarta, which is the one of the Irish vampires.
that's not an early one. That was definitely that the Avatar was definitely written down and made up, and
That's
it's
all.
not. It's just not. I'm sorry. That's one of the ones that I just happen to know. There's no early source. There's no very early source for that I'm
No, well,
aware
no,
of.
there's no ancient source for it, no.
No, and
And a
I'm
lot
pretty
of
sure it was made. Yeah, this claim that is exactly the kind of thing that people just don't. They'll say, "Oh, Bram Stoker was trying about this Irish vampire." You're like, well, I don't think that story probably existed before about 1850. I can't remember the dates on that one, but before some date, there's no evidence of it. No one talks about it, and then a guy writes about this when vampires are already in the cultural milieu. Hmm, probably not.
yeah, well,
Probably.
Carmilla was even earlier than that, and then there was a very famous book about Transylvanian folklore, and that was really what kicked off the big vampire craze in that time.
I mean, if we're talking about how it's changed, I think one of the fascinating ones is ghosts, which you sort of feel like because they are so fundamental and go back to Babylonian times, as you said,
Yeah,
but they're just so radically different between different times. But certainly now we've sort of collectively, and I think to be fair, a lot of stories now on not just now, but do move away from this. But that white sheet image is so that's what it is, and ghosts being largely insubstantial. And anything deviating from that often gets called a demon or classified as something else. But that's not recognizable in what anyone was calling ghosts. Go back a few hundred years. The Byland Abbey stories being the medieval ones on well, and the ghosts in there are weird creatures
yeah,
that are physical. They're mostly physical, but they turn into well, does it turn itself inside out and speak out of its own mouth, I think, at some point, and it becomes fire and then a raven, and somebody has to carry a ghost over a river, and they're just totally different from what we know now. And if even that can change, which feels so fundamental and has sort of been helped along by having the Christian framework that sort of has spirits in there, which keeps it along a bit, and but it's still changed radically. And so yeah, things change all the time, and that's great. I think it's only the problem when you go back and say, but that's how it was. I don't.
no,
Yeah, I'm a storyteller who uses this stuff and chops and changes it and makes it modern and stuff like that. So I would never say you can't do this. You can do it as much as you like. Just don't pretend. And I think that's it, really, isn't it? It's just don't pretend that it's actually old
yeah.
because
What we do on our History of Holidays, a series that we do with Mark from Mark Soup. Every time we always start these things, we always preface with, you can celebrate whatever you like. You can make new customs because we do it all the time. Just don't say they're ancient because we know they're not. But people find something wrong with that. They really want to hold on to something that they think is ancient. But who cares? People make up stuff all the time. There's
I
nothing wrong
think,
with that either.
yeah, and I think I do understand that, like that desire, and that is where because sometimes, no, it makes it sound like I'm some fact checker of folklore,
No, that's
and
me.
yeah, that might be you, but I don't know. One of the responses that I do get when I have discussed things like this is, um, well, I don't care. I don't care. Who
Yeah,
cares? You can't know anyway, so who cares? But and I've thought about that quite seriously. Like, well, does this matter? I mean, as much as anything matters. And I think the point I come down to is that the people are who are engaging with it do care that it is genuine, or they wouldn't want it. People want to know that this stuff is old because it says this stuff is, this is an ancient Babylonian custom, and that's put. If it wasn't, if it was, I just made this up, and wrote it down, they might not engage with it because they're not going to the fantasy or whatever. They're looking for that, and you're presenting it as that. And if you've presented something actually, then you're not giving people what you think they're giving them. And if people want
exactly.
genuine old stuff, there's a lot of genuine old stuff to connect to. I don't know if I've ever actually said this, but I'm not a pagan. I'm an atheist, but obviously I've got a lot of neo-pagan friends and associates through what I do. But I've been very impressed by some of the authors and pagans now, very strong believers who write about the folklore, but also say, well, this is what we know, but also combine that with their faith, with their belief. And you can absolutely do that and do it very persuasively. And then you've got real, genuine stuff. Morgan Daimler and Mara Starling are the two ladies I'm going to mention now who do that superbly. And you can, and then you can get both. You can get this real go back and look at it, and this is what we do know, and you can also connect on the spiritual side with that, but people clearly want. And yeah, but otherwise, yeah, do whatever you like, and if it gets big enough, what's the sound? Wolfen note? Oh, I'm getting that wrong. The
Oh, you mean
kid who
it?
creates the idea of, or somebody claims that their kid created an idea of a wolf. I do not know the background, but I've been invited to parties for this celebration of wolves festival that's on particular dates. I've never been to
It's
one
the night
yet.
before. It's the night before May Day. It's May
See,
Day
you know
Eve.
it.
Yeah.
See, you know this thing that did not exist when either of us were children, and it's now that big that it's a real celebration, and that's wonderful. And I absolutely love stuff like that. Please
Yeah,
do,
so
yeah.
it really doesn't go back as far as beyond the Victorian period, to be quite honest with you. And there are a lot of people who see these things and they look at rituals. So, for example, when you look at there's a lot of mistake made, like we talked about earlier about Halloween, and how people look at a lot of the rituals about these things, and when they look at these rituals, they say, "Oh, these look very pagan." You just go, actually, no, a lot of these rituals were old Catholic, and because of the Reformation stripped away a lot of these rituals in certain areas. And so now when you have Americans looking at Halloween, and this happened when I was a kid, you had a lot of Americans looking at Halloween customs when they started getting really popular in the 80s and going, oh no, these are heathen pagan stuff. Like you can't we as Protestants, we can't be celebrating this. And I'm going, Halloween is a secular version of a Catholic holiday. There's no I love when they're like, oh, it's devil worship, and I'm like, you need to have Christianity to talk about the devil. There's no devil in any pagan ideas. The Christianity made him up. So whenever I see those things, I just laugh. But this is unfortunately how we kind of get mixed up in folklore gets thrown in together with religion and then rituals again. The great example that I like to give is, Graham, do you like Comic-Con?
I've never been to a Comic Con. Is
Okay,
that
so what about a Ren Fair? You've been to a Ren Fair?
we don't have? Well, I've been to big LARP events and I've been to music festivals, but we don't have Ren fairs there's one called Fantasy Forest that I can't get tickets because they still are like that so fast. We don't have Ren fairs here. We need Ren fairs. We need Ren fairs.
So for those who are
Anyway,
listening, for cultural, so these are ritualistic cultural events, right? If I say
oh
the
yeah.
word Ren Fair, people know a Ren Fair happens around May Day. We all dress up in a fantasy element. It's not in any way historical because we got pirates, we have Renaissance people. You have, the people dressed up as early medieval peasants. Very obviously, we all understand that this is not a historical event. It's the same thing with Comic-Con, right? If you have a local Comic-Con, it's a ritualistic thing that happens once a year. You dress up. There are things that we do at a Comic-Con. We have rituals that we partake in a Comic-Con. We take pictures. We go see our favorite people. Even at Ren Fair, you'll dress up, you'll go see the Queen, maybe you'll go see the Queen, or you'll present yourself to the presenting royalty. You'll have fun with some Vikings, you'll have fun with some pirates. And we all understand that even though this is a once a year event, it's not tied to a holiday, it's not tied to a religion. This is a cultural, folklore rich event that we all take part in. And we, today in modern times, we would not look at these things and say Comic-Con is part of a religion or Ren Fair is part of a religion, right? So why would we do that with certain folklore customs and certain rituals in ancient times? It just kind of it a little bit there's a little bit of a disconnect there.
I think in some ways this is a very surface level first year university reading of it, and yet I still think there is something true to say that our society as a whole today is, for a lot of people, lacking rituals, certainly rituals that we all agree on, and big community events. And I think you say you can do all these things, but I think actually they're not the norm, and they're certainly their subcultures are brought into them. And I think that there's people are looking for events like that. The only references that they've got are often religious ones
It's a
from
good
the
point.
rituals that do still exist, and the memory of them still linger from the church. And therefore they feel that for it to be valid to go and do something, they need a reason that chimes with that. I don't want to break it down into too much about capitalism and go off on one, but
Well,
there
to
is
be
something
fair,
about
a lot
society
of
like
a
that.
lot of our customs still exist because of capitalism. I don't think we would have Halloween and
That's
trick-or-treating.
true.
I don't think we would Christmas in general. I mean, don't forget, before Victorian times, Christmas was uh, I wouldn't say minor, but it was certainly a lesser.
Yeah,
It was always
definitely.
Easter that was the bigger holiday before Victorian times. And as Easter kind of played down, and then Christmas kind of came up as this enormous cultural, industrial, commercialist event, Christmas swept up everything. And same thing with Halloween. Halloween, the chocolate, the costumes, everything just sweeps up in this great. And I think in order for a ritual to, I wouldn't say survive, but become popular, it has to be commercialized in a certain way. And so I give you the example again of Comic-Con. There in 1970, there was one Comic-Con. Now there are thousands and thousands of Comic-Cons all over the world because it has commercialized with cosplay and with inviting cultural guests and all this kind of thing. I think that rituals, in order to continue, have to be commercialized in our landscape nowadays.
I think, unfortunately, that's possibly true, though. I don't know where I feel on how, I don't know how to feel about that, but I think you're definitely right, certainly, and there's a lot of good that can come out of them, definitely. How did we get onto this? This feels like we've actually wandered quite far away from folklore
Well,
now,
I'll
even though
ask
these
about
are
it
all
because
folkloric practices,
it is.
obviously.
That's what it is. I would say that something like Comic-Con is a modern folkloric practice, absolutely.
Mhm.
Because if I say the word, even though you've never been there, you know what it is and you know what happens there. And you'd love to go, you'd love to partake, but maybe there isn't one in your area, but maybe you could start one in your area, right? So speaking of which, so what are some of your favorite folklorists and some of your favorite folklore creatures that you like to talk about?
Oh, okay. So actually, just yeah. Um. So when you asked me this question, firstly, I made a list of folklorists that I liked, and it was very long. So I whittled it down to two very different groups, and I think when we're talking about folklorists, we sort of there's very different people that we mean, as we've covered, people who are very scientific in their approach and rigorous and there are people who just write stories down which may or may not be true that they might have heard from a person, or they said they did, and now they're a folklorist. So I've sort of divided it into two. I've divided it into the 19th century one, who are more towards that. Particularly my two of my favourites being MC Balfour, Maria Clothiel Balfour. She's not a folklorist of particular note. She wrote some articles in the 1890s um, about Lincolnshire folklore, and she wrote some articles a bit later about Northumberland folklore when she moved to later. Um, and what I like about her is that her stories that she's written about Lincolnshire folklore are, in my opinion, just brilliant. They are unlike anything else, which does make me suspect she made them up. But an academic, more than me, did a bit of study and say, no, she didn't make them up. Still not entirely convinced by that, but at least we've got some reason she wasn't just an author, and they are absolutely insane stories, unlike anything else. That, and what I think is really interesting about them is they are folk horror folk tales. Um, they are set in the world of the Lincolnshire marshes, which is about 30 kilometers away from big cities and railway stations by the time she's writing them. But she describes them as this backwater where paganism still has a hold over the people, and which the dead from centuries past live under the bogs, and great big winged things inhabit the air, and the people are always looking over their shoulder because the boggards are out to get them, and and her stories are also, a lot of them are very bleak. There's a story, I tell a couple of them on the podcast. There's one about a dead hand that essentially throttles a guy to death as he wanders into the swamp, and then his mother dies of grief. That's the story. There's another one where some children get sent to hell and chopped up.
Oh my
They're
gosh.
crazy
No
and
different than saint
amazing.
stories,
And
really.
I love them. I just absolutely love them. And then they're not like anything else I've ever discovered. And then they're the only one I've really discovered that claims to be folk stories passed on, that very much says the people were pagan in the past, actually worshipping the old forces, the old gods, which does make me suspect she made them up. But nevertheless, absolutely love it. They've given me some of the best stories. And as I say, not a folklorist, so I can tell these stories and they're wonderful. Go and read them in translation because they're written in a crazy dialect language as well, which
I just want to mention
is
something
difficult to understand.
with regard to
Yeah.
that. There is a, so I don't know if you know who Jessie Saxby is, but
Of,
she was, yeah.
yeah, of
And so
course.
there's a lot of questions about, again, she claimed to be a folklorist and going around and collecting things. And then people discovered that actually she made up most of her tales. And again, there's nothing wrong with that. You can create your own folklore, but just don't say that they're ancient and don't say that everybody in this region knew this story or told this tale. There's nothing wrong with creating your own folklore, but just say so.
And I think the thing about Saxby that's interesting is she is, I mean, she did, unlike Balfour, I think I can quite confidently state without contradiction from an academic that Jessie Saxby definitely made up big things that became well known. Um, but her stuff became, because her works were so well known, and especially later on into the 21st century, her works have sort of become genuine folklore because they're now passed around and people believe them, and that itself becomes the act of folklore.
Yes.
And for those, I suspect that most people watching this will already know it's not true, but the Wolver, which
Oh, my
is
favorite. I love
that's
Wolver.
that's
Yeah.
Saxby. That's Saxby's key one. She named her house Wolverstone, didn't she? Um, she's writing about this werewolf that essentially gives poor people fish, and it is made up. But people have said it so much that it's sort of entered into the, and this happens all the time, all the time. This happens, and that's sort of cool. But yeah, um, I suspect Balfour's very similar. But as I say, I'm hiding behind an academic who did a lot of research and said it was true, so I'm going to go with her instead. So John Roby is another one. John Roby, he's a 19th century folklorist, very early 19th century, writing similar time to the Brothers Grimm. But unlike them, where they started off collecting very short stories, they made them a bit more literary as they went along. He collects folk stories that are like little nubs of folk stories, which he must know. And I say collects, he knows somehow these little folk stories that appear to be true. And then he essentially writes these short, usually gothic, really heavily literary versions of these tales. And everyone absolutely loves them. The Victorian community goes mad for them. He gets books printed. It works fantastically. He makes these stories big, but they bear so little resemblance to the original. But the reason I really like him, apart from the fact that I found a lot of his stories and him, these stories have now become very well known in Lancashire as well. So they get repeated as folk stories. They have entered back into the folk story tradition through him. Is that he mostly reminds me of me. He's far more talented than me, but he takes tiny stories of what must have just been a sentence or two and then writes 30,000 words on them. And I sort of do the same with my podcast. So I like to think that I'm walking in his footsteps.
So can you tell people where they can find your stories and
Oh,
engage with your folklore?
yeah, of course. Okay, so I've got a podcast. It's called Tales of Britain and Ireland, which was a very clever name, that one. And yeah, I'm on wherever you find podcasts. I'm quite small, but you can find me everywhere. I do have a YouTube channel as well. Just type in Tales of Britain and Ireland, and you will be able to listen to me tell lengthy stories, which are more scripted than this. I should say I script very tightly. Even most of my asides are scripted down. So this sort of thing is quite unusual for me to hear me ramble so much. And of course, you
I
can.
hope you had fun. I hope
Oh,
you
love it.
enjoyed rambling.
Love it. Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. So yes, where was I? Yeah, so yeah, we're okay here. Yeah. Balfour, Roby. So they're the ones that I'm like, they're the fun ones. Some more modern, proper ones. I think I mentioned his name before. I think Seamus O'Dolerga, James Delargy, uh, Irish and English name, who set up the Irish Folklore Commission. He's not got a lot of work himself, but his contribution to folklore is incredible. And he's generally, everything on Duchess comes kind of through him, basically. And so I think he has to be absolutely up there because that entire wealth of stuff you can read is because of him and many people around him at the time. But he was the driving force behind it. And yeah, I think he's just got to be up there as one of my favorite ones as well. I was going to mention Michael Fortune as well, which we already have. He's collecting nowadays, and I really like his take on things. And I like that as a folklorist, he is still interviewing people, a lot of old people, some young people as well, and really recording folklore still. And I find a lot of what he does very interesting to watch, and I really like his takes as well. Um, Who else am I going to mention? I'm going to give a shout out to Simon Young, Dr. Simon Young, who I've interviewed for my podcast, the only interview I've ever done on my podcast, which I wouldn't go and find him on that. He has his own podcast called Boggart and Banshee. I would go and listen to him on that. He is a modern folklorist who has done loads of stuff that your listeners will find really interesting because he just covers a whole load of topics. And he also releases source books for free. He releases lots of little bits and pieces as little texts on stuff as well, and just makes it really accessible for people who aren't academics to these topics. And he really does cover everything. So Boggarts is sort of a speciality of his, but he covers everything. He covers UFOs and ghosts and levitation and banshees and changelings, and his output is prestigious. And I think
Prodigious.
prodigious. And I think he's also done what people might find interesting: the fairy census, which is a collection of modern day fairy encounters, which I think I can say is available for free online. But this is modern day, first conducted, I think, in the mid 2010s and then updated last year or the year before. And that's really fascinating about people experiencing fairies today, not stories, but genuine interaction with fairies. And so, yeah, I definitely recommend his work. I think it's quite nice, by the way, that we're at a time when there are so many people that I could have put on this list who are modern folklorists. Like, there's huge numbers of people creating in this area, academics and less, people a bit more like me. Most of them know a little bit more than me, as well. Just amateurs getting involved, and there's so much good stuff to read. The other person I would really shout out, just to so I have somebody who isn't from Britain and Ireland, is Jürgen Hubert. I'm sorry if I've just pronounced your surname wrong there, Jürgen, who is a German folklorist, and he is translating lots of German folk tales into English for the first time. And once again, a lot of his work is available online for free. He also does books. He also has a very good Patreon that I'm signed up to. And what that does is just give you these stories that, yeah, they've been in German for quite a long time, but then they may not even been collected together. They haven't been collected together in the same way. And he's creating this accessible to English archive of German folk tales that are not like, well, some of them are, but they're generally not like the Brothers Grimm. They're new, they're different. I find one of the things about folklore collecting that I often run up to, which frustrates me somewhat in the United Kingdom and Ireland, is that the folklore collectors were very prudish, or at least if they weren't, they couldn't get anything published that wasn't. So there's a whole load of stuff missing from our folklore, very clearly, that was recorded about anything slightly sexual. And that's not always the case with the German folk tales. There's a lot more of that survives. They're a bit less worried about it. So you get some really weird stuff that I think gives you a bit more insight into what people are actually saying, not the sanitized Victorian versions of stuff. So his folk tales are great. And he also has just a wonderful manner in how he writes as well and makes them funny and entertaining. So yes, I would recommend him. I'm assuming you're going to put links in the video or something, but please do. Yeah, and then yeah, I've just got a whole list of people just written down here, and I could just go on. Mark Norman, who has the podcast, the Folklore podcast, probably
Hmm.
know it.
Yes, Mark
Mara
is a
Starling,
good dude.
yep, absolutely. Writes books, has the Folklore podcast. Brilliant place to start and indeed probably
He
finish. There's a
asked me
lot of
once a
content there.
question about, I can't remember what it was, but he asked me if something was ancient, and I said, no, I'm sorry. Another thing that was invented by Margaret Murray and Lady Raglan, and his entire email back was,
Oh, just need to write about inventing. I think I think there's a book in writing stuff where you're like, this is all the fake folklore, but also making it interesting. Not saying, oh, it's awful, but just putting it all together and saying, none of this stuff, but isn't it cool anyway, what these Victorians came up with that people then believed?
again, there's not, as we say, there's nothing wrong with making up new stuff.
No.
Just say it's new.
Yeah. I know. Jeremy Hart's a good folklorist. He writes lots of good books. Icy Sedgwick presents a podcast on folklore. I mentioned Mara Starling for Welsh stuff, Morgan Daimler for Irish stuff, after Michael Fortune, and more and more. There's just so many people I could mention here that it just feels too much to go on.
So quickly tell us some of
Okay.
your favorite folklore characters.
Right, creatures. You asked me creatures, so I'm going to give two things that I've realized we're probably well over time now. But first of all, I'm going to show you this. One of my favorite. You can't see it. For anyone who is listening, I'm now holding up to the camera something you can't see even on the camera,
It
which is a
says
massive.
monsters, ghosts, fairies, and other supernaturals of
It
Britain.
is, and what this is I made it for my live shows, and it's a list taken from the Denham Tracts, which is a folkloric work from 1846-ish. Um, a list of creatures from Britain, only Britain, or only England, maybe even. It's not complete at all. It's in no way complete. And there is on this list over 200 creatures. And I just love it. Some stuff we only know it comes from here. Uh, and it just goes on and on and on. Yeah. Gilburn, tails, knockers, elves, rawheads, men with the wogs, old shocks, oofs, padfoots, pixies, pictrees, giants, dwarfs, etc., etc. I once thought about poker rapping all of this. When I actually read it out live, I was like, nope, I'm just going to tell people some of the rude ones. You've got you've got shagfoals.
Please make a poker rap version of that.
Oh, I started it. Believe me. I can't remember how it goes now, but I did. But no, it's like I
That's
haven't got the
amazing.
I haven't got the creative ability to put it all together. But it was like no, well, shagfoals and knockers and melch sticks and mum pokers and hob thrusts and spunks. And whenever I read out all the rude ones, people always spot one that I've missed. They're always like, "Oh, but what about that? Sounds pretty rude too." I'm like, "Oh, it does." Now you put it like that. We've got hobbits on this list, the only pre-Tolkien mention of the word hobbits. And I think I just really like this as a list. And when you said, tell me your favorite creatures when we were prepping for this, I thought, right, gotta mention the Denim Track list. It's wonderful. Yeah, if you know anyone who can do a poker app, then I can help them do that. If you want. It's great. Um, but none of those are my favorite creatures. I have a favorite creature from folklore. I didn't used to, but I've got one now, and that is the Kelpie.
Ah, okay. Tell
Um,
everybody what that is.
so a Kelpie, well, for those of you who don't, Kelpie's brilliant. A Kelpie is well,
It's
the
a
thing
water
is,
horse mermaid?
no, you see, this is the problem. If you go and look, so much of Kelpie says, "Oh, it's a water horse. It's a horse who lives in the water," and that's where the rot starts with people being like, "Oh, that's I suppose it drowns people." That's lots of creatures do that, but the Kelpie, it's so much more than that because in lots of the stories about the Kelpie, they are shape shifting and they are proper par excellence, shapeshifters par excellence. They are the very best shapeshifters. They can be people very easily. They can be old women and sexy young men and sexy young women, and they can make their whole bodies lengthen and they can do all kinds of things. So they can walk amongst us. And my personal feeling about the Kelpies and the range of stories, they will murder you as you're walking by the banks of a loch. They will murder you by knocking on the door and asking to come in for the night and just stay and come and just, oh, I'll just sleep in your bed. And then they'll start neighing and tear you apart. They are incredibly dangerous creatures and I love them. And my contention is that they should occupy the space in modern day horror films that vampires do now. And I think Kelpies were unjustly taken out of this because they've got better teeth than vampires. They are much better, hairier creatures than werewolves. So they got that. They can transform whenever they like. They haven't got the weaknesses. They can come out during the sun. They've not got the garlic problem. Sometimes they've got silver, but broadly, they're just better in every way. Incredibly dangerous. And I imagine this scenario where you've got a story about a Scottish laird, because they come from Scotland, who moves to London and starts a sort of high society club based around betting on the races and becomes ingratiated with the locals, and then there's a subplot about how there's a stable lad who falls in love with this, like, well, gets an attachment to this big black horse in the stables who's never only there when the laird isn't. And then you've got livers that start to rise to the top of the River Thames because Kelpies don't eat livers. And then you've got a showdown conclusion with a cunning woman and a giant rat in the sewers of London. And that book about a Kelpie is written instead of Dracula, and we have Kelpies instead of vampires, and everything's just better. And they have the place that they should be, as opposed to be relegated to these little like C tier. And people say water horses. Well, like these things are terrifying. Um, so
So are
yes,
you going
that's
to
my
write
rant
that book,
about
Graham?
Kelpies, which I've given quite a lot now. Sometimes they're nice as well, but that's boring. Sometimes they're nice, and there's a Kelpie. There's a story about a Kelpie who has a child with a human woman, and then she leaves, and he's got to raise the kid on his own, and he does it, but he's so sad that she left, and it's sort of heartbreaking. So there's a lot to them as well. I love Kelpies, so yes, Kelpies. That's my favorite. I've got lots of ideas about Kelpies, and people should know them better. And
Well,
for
you've given the
the ones who
monster
don't.
lover community something to think about.
Well, yeah, I mean horses. Come on, guys. Come on, guys. It's staring you right in You've got, your typical young American uh, adult novel protagonist. If she's got like your typical wolf boy, or bat boy, or she's got horse boy to choose from, well, just saying, just saying,
There's a market
might
there
be a better
for
option.
sure. So are you going to write that book, Graham?
No, I can't, I don't have time. I do my podcast like 5 times a year. And yes, I have very little time to do all the things that I want to do. I'm always looking for a rich patron. So if anyone just wants the proper 19th century style, just allow me to quit my job and to come and record podcast episodes and write books at your whim, then I'll do it. Consider this my application right here. Yes, I'll do that anytime you want. But otherwise, probably not. I'll try and give my members some actual episodes this year, which they'll be pleased for, I hope.